Welcome everyone to the November meeting of the Foxborough Historical Society. Before we begin our meeting, I would ask you to join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Well, this is our final meeting of 2022. Where did the year go? Mother Nature reminds us of time passing as the trees are mostly bare and the first snow cannot be far behind. As I mentioned at our last meeting on Founders Day next year, we're investigating the feasibility of having an informative table at the event. I am pleased to report thus far we have 4 older homes that have expressed an interest, and if anybody has, this is at the Founders Day event, to have a display basically of some of the older homes in town, and what we'd like to do is to have a recent picture of the front of the house and any old picture you had, so we can juxtaposition them and make up a display of homes that exist plus the way they look as many years ago as you have a photograph of. So, if you own an older home and you would be interested, we really welcome your input. That would be great. That ends the business portion of our meeting. I would now like to present our speaker this evening, Mr. Eric J. Dolin. Many of us will remember Eric's fascinating talk earlier this year on the subject of when America first met China. And this is now, I believe, his latest book. Yep. And so, without more ado, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks. I'll tell you a little bit more about myself. I live in Marblehead. Drove down today. Took 2 hours and 10 minutes because of an accident. It was miserable. I'm not saying Foxborough is miserable. Foxborough is very nice, but oh my goodness, it was horrible driving down here. But yeah, this is my 15th book. This book came out last May. I'm just about finishing up a new book. I could talk about it a little bit more later. But thanks for coming out. I appreciate it. It was late in the day on June 3rd, 1780, when Salem Captain Jonathan Harridan and his privateer Pickering was heading for the friendly port of Bilbao, Spain. The British privateer Achilles, however, stood in the way. Nobody would have faulted Harridan had he fled in the face of this superior foe. While the Pickering had a crew of 38 men and 16 cannons, the Achilles had a crew of 130 men and 43 cannons. Hardly a fair fight, but that's not how Harridan saw it. He relished the chance to confront the enemy and strike a blow for the revolutionary cause. Turning to the British prisoner who had informed him of the Achilles' might, Harridan calmly said, "I shan't run from her." And he didn't. As the Achilles began its advance, Harridan told his men that though the Achilles appeared to be superior to them in force, he had no doubt that they should beat her off if they were firm and steady and did not throw away their fire. Meanwhile, in Bilbao, which was a fairly large port at the time, word spread that there was about to be a major battle just offshore, and about 1,000 people rushed to the beach to watch the spectacle. Booming broadsides and musket fire filled the air. One of Harridan's crew said that while shot flew around him, Harridan was as calm and steady as amidst a shower of snowflakes. The battle raged for about 2 hours, at which point Harridan told his men to put bar shot into the cannons. Bar shot is basically when you take a cannonball and cut it in half, and then you solder the 2 ends of it to an iron bar. So when that comes out of the cannon, it starts spinning wildly, and it could shred rigging and sails and do damage to masts as well. Now, it caused great damage to the Achilles, and having had enough, the Achilles turned and fled with the rebel commander close behind. But despite its injuries, the Achilles was too fast. It got away. Harridan spun about with the Pickering. He picked up a ship called the Golden Eagle, which the Achilles had briefly taken back from him. It was a British merchant ship. Now, all told, 8 of Pickering's men had been injured. One of them was killed. His head was sheared off by a cannonball. Now, I want to tell you a little story about this plaque. This is the top third of a much larger plaque, which I read about while I was working on the book. The plaque was located in Salem, Massachusetts. I live in Marblehead, Massachusetts, which is right next door. The plaque commemorates Jonathan Harridan's heroics, and in particular, the battle against the Achilles. So, the book that I read said that the plaque was hanging on the side of a house at an intersection in Salem where Harridan used to live. So I hopped on my bike and I rode over there and I looked at all the houses in the intersection and I couldn't find this plaque. I found a couple of other historic plaques, but not this one. So I went home a little bit discouraged and I called the local historian and I asked her if she knew where the plaque was. And she laughed and she said, "Yes, I do. It's down the street in a barbecue restaurant, a Korean barbecue restaurant." So I got back on my bike and I rode over to this Korean barbecue restaurant and I walked in. The woman was very excited because it was the midst of COVID. She didn't have any customers. She thought I was there to order some food. I said, "No, I'm actually here to look at that plaque behind your head." How it ended up in the Korean barbecue restaurant, nobody knows. But I think that it's indicative of how American history has treated privateers all these many years, sort of shunted it to the side and not treated it quite as seriously as it deserves.
When was the plaque made?
1909. It was put there by the Sons of the American Revolution. Now, Harridan remained in Bilbao for 2 months before returning to Salem. On the return voyage, true to form, he captured 3 more British prizes and sent them into Salem. And when he arrived back in Salem, the owners of the Pickering decided to honor their intrepid captain by giving him this flask, this silver tankard, and 2 identical mugs, all inscribed with a profile of the Pickering and Jonathan Harridan's initials. Now, during his tenure in the Massachusetts Navy and as a privateer, Harridan took many prizes. He captured hundreds of cannons, as many British prisoners, and he died of tuberculosis at the age of 59 in 1803. And his obituary in the Salem Gazette lauded him as one of the most able and valiant commanders that the war had produced. Now, the Pickering was one of nearly 2,000 American privateers, and Harridan was one of tens of thousands of privateersmen who operated during the conflict. Privateers were armed vessels owned and operated by private individuals who had government permission to capture enemy ships during times of war. That permission came in the form of a letter of marque, which was a legal document, formal legal document, that gave the bearer the right to seize vessels belonging to belligerent nations and to bring those vessels and their cargoes into port as prizes. Those prizes, if they were determined to be a legitimate prize, in other words, a British ship and not a neutral or a friendly ship, those prizes would be sold, the ship and its cargo, and the proceeds from the auction would in turn be split between the men who served on the privateer and the owners of the privateer. Now, despite the contributions made by Harridan and thousands of other privateersmen during the war, many believe that privateering was a sideshow in the conflict. Privateering has long been given short shrift in both military and maritime histories of this era. Rebels at Sea fills the void by offering a comprehensive account of privateering that demonstrates that it was critical to winning the war. American privateersmen took the maritime fight to the British and made them bleed, in countless daring actions against British merchant ships and not a few warships. Privateers caused British maritime insurance rates to rise precipitously, diverted critical British resources to protecting British ships and to attacking American privateers, added to British weariness over this war that seemingly would never end, and played a starring role in bringing France into the war on the side of the Americans, which was a critical turning point in the conflict. On the domestic front, privateering brought much-needed goods and military supplies into the new nation. It provided cash infusions for the war effort, boosted colonial economies, and bolstered Americans' confidence that it might succeed in this quixotic war against the most powerful nation in the world. Now, thousands of books have approached the revolution from virtually every possible angle. Rebels at Sea places privateersmen at the very center of the war effort. It demonstrates that when the United States was only a tenuous idea, they stepped forward and risked their lives to help make it a reality. In fighting against the British on the seas, the Americans relied on 4 different maritime forces. There were state navies. There was Washington's secret navy, which operated for about a year and a half at the very beginning of the conflict, the Continental Navy, and privateers. And of these 4, privateers were by far the most numerous and the most effective. They captured somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,600 to 1,800 British ships that were valued at many millions of pounds. Now, Massachusetts was the first in many things, and it was also the first in privateering. In November of 1775, Massachusetts passed the first Privateering Act in the colonies. Now, the importance of the Massachusetts Privateering Act in unleashing the privateering across the colonies became more apparent in hindsight. Some 40 years later, John Adams would write that the passage of the Massachusetts Act is one of the most important documents in history. The Declaration of Independence is a trifle in comparison with it. New Hampshire and Rhode Island followed suit in early 1776 with their own privateering statutes. And at the same time, people were pressuring the Continental Congress to authorize privateers across all the colonies instead of doing it on a piecemeal colony by colony basis. And on March 23, 1776, Congress passed the Privateering Resolution into law. Now, with their capital tied up at the docks, ship owners eagerly pursued privateering because it brought back ships they could sell and goods as well. Many men invested in privateering. Indeed, it spurred a speculative frenzy across the colonies. Among the more illustrious speculators were the generals George Washington, Nathaniel Greene, and Henry Knox, as well as Paul Revere. Privateer captains would usually be chosen by the owners of the ship on the basis of them being known to the owner because they probably worked for him before. This guy, Elias Davis Sr., has anybody here been to the Cape Ann Museum in Gloucester? Oh, you're missing something wonderful. You should go up there. One of the best museums in this region. Anyway, they have an historic house right next door to it, and it happens to be the Elias Davis Sr. house. And if you go into it, this picture is over the mantelpiece. Now, bear in mind that while I was working on this book, it was COVID. My wife was home. Her job, she came home and worked from home. My daughter, who's a literary agent in New York, came home for a year and a half. My son, who was a student at Northeastern, came home. And I got to tell you, they all were the worst coworkers I've ever had in my life because I like to take a lot of breaks and talk and chat, and they were too serious. They worked too hard. But anyway, when I saw this picture, I called my daughter Lily into my room, into my office, because she's only read one of my books before. My son hasn't read any of my books yet. So it's sort of like the shoemaker's kids, what they say, the cobbler's kids. But I brought Lily into my office and I said, Lily, take a look at this guy. You know, he was a privateering captain. And Lily took a good long look at him and she goes, you know, Dad, I could really get into privateering. And she actually has read the book, so there you go. Now, while crewmen were sometimes known by the owners, the men who were sort of the men before the mast, the main crewmen, were usually not, and they had to be found and enticed. And what they did is the owners would do something called the hearty welcome. They would rent a local pub and they'd invite everybody to come in and get drunk, and then they'd sign the Articles of Agreement. This is an ad for such an event in Beverly, Massachusetts. Now, black men served on many privateers. Some were freemen, like James Fortin here. He lived in Philadelphia, and at the age of 14, he signed on to the Pennsylvania privateer, the Royal Lewis. Fortin's job was to bring gunpowder from the ship's magazine to the cannons. Now, the cruise was a triumph. The Royal Lewis captured 7 British prizes. They were brought into Philadelphia, where they were sold for quite a bit of money. Fortin was able to give some money to his parents and keep some for himself. He just escaped death, however, because one of the ships that they captured shot a cannon into the side of the Royal Lewis. It went right through the hull, right where the cannon was that he was supplying ammunition for, and 3 men were killed, but Fortin survived. Now, he was so excited by his first voyage on a privateer that he signed up for the next cruise by the Royal Lewis. In hindsight, he shouldn't have been so eager, because barely a day out of port, the Royal Lewis was captured by the HMS Amphion, captained by John Bazley. Now, Fortin was petrified, because he had read, and in fact it was true, that men of his complexion who were captured by British ships would usually be sent to the slave marts in the Caribbean, and he thought that was going to be his fate. That was going to be his fate. But fortunately for him, Captain John Bazley had a 12-year-old son on the ship who needed a companion, and for reasons unknown, Bazley tapped Fortin to be that companion. And they got along famously for about 4 weeks until the HMS Amphion sailed into New York, which was held by the British. Captain Bazley gave Fortin a choice. He said, you can either disembark here with the men of the Royal Lewis and be placed on the Jersey prison ship, or you can go to London as a ward of my son. You'll have money, education, and your freedom. What do you decide? Fortin was a true patriot, and he said, I'm going with my men. And he did, and he lasted for 8 months on board the Jersey prison ship before being traded in a prisoner exchange. Now, other black men were enslaved persons who signed on after running away from their owners, hoping to gain their freedom. Many owners also rented out their enslaved individuals as a money-making scheme. Now, this painting was at one time thought to be the only known contemporary painting of a black American privateer, and as such, it was valued at $300,000. The guy who owned it was a urologist who lived in Rhode Island. And because of the fame of this painting, he was often asked to loan it out to be used in books or in exhibitions. And in the early 2000s, Fraunce's Tavern in New York reached out to him and said, we want to have an exhibition of black individuals' participation in the American Revolution. Will you loan us your painting to be the centerpiece of that exhibit? He said, sure, let me send it out to an art restorer first to make it look a little bit more presentable. So he did. The art restorer took out a cloth and a mild solvent, and he started rubbing the hand. Off came the black paint, revealing a white hand beneath. Turns out that somebody in the middle of the 20th century knew that a unique painting of a black American privateer would be worth far more than a painting of a white American mariner from the same era forged or doctored the painting. And he was right, it was much more valuable, because once it was found out to be a doctored painting, its value plummeted to $3,000, and Fraunce's Tavern backed out of using it in their exhibition. So it went back to the urologist's house and was put on back in the living room. I happen to know the urologist's son, who now owns this painting. Now, many have argued that privateersmen were motivated more by greed than patriotism. Famed naval officer John Paul Jones, shown here, believed it was nothing but greed. A less cynical assessment views privateersmen as being motivated by a combination of profits and patriotism, and this view is closer to the truth. The perspective of most privateersmen is best reflected in the comments of a privateersman and soldier named Christopher Prince, who said, looking back on his long revolutionary career, through the whole course of the war, I have had two motives in view. One was the freedom of my country, and the other was the luxuries of life. Now, privateers experienced many triumphs and tragedies during the war. One of the most successful privateers was the Pennsylvania brig Holker, which over the span of 4 years, with 11 captains, captured 72 British prizes. In a single cruise, it captured 10 large British merchantmen that were brought back into port and realized nearly £2 million during the sail. Now, one of the worst tragedies to befall American privateers occurred during the Penobscot Expedition, the largest American maritime force assembled during the Revolution. It consisted of 19 warships, 12 of which were privateers. Their mission was to dislodge a British fort that was being built in the Penobscot Bay area on the peninsula, which today is Castine. The fort, called Fort George, was being built specifically to serve as a launching point for sallies into the American colonies to attack nests of privateers. The expedition sailed from Boston on July 19, 1779. Now keep in mind, not only were there 19 ships, there were over 2,500 soldiers and another 1,000 mariners on board. Poor organization and leadership and a critical delay in launching the attack led to a total fiasco when on August 14th the Royal Navy showed up in force at the mouth of the bay. It was a complete rout. In the end, 16 American ships were burned by their own men to keep them from falling into the enemy's hands. The rest were either sunk or captured. And it must have been quite a sight because the Americans had finally, right before the British sailed into the bay, they had finally worked up the courage to attack the fort full on, and they had primed all of the cannons, readying them to be shot. So when those ships were set afire, a lot of the cannons exploded. Now, as for the men, they bolted into the woods and tried to find their way back to New Hampshire and lower Massachusetts before starving. And many have labeled the Penobscot affair the worst disaster that the American Navy suffered up until December 7, 1941, and the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, one of the most important things that privateers did during the Revolution was to help bring France over to the American side. In the early years of the war, France allowed American privateers to use their ports in the Caribbean and on the continent to reprovision, sell prizes, and also pick up French mariners to serve as crew members. All of this was in violation of treaties that France had with Britain. And that, plus the damage that the American privateers did to British ships, infuriated the British. The Continental Congress sent this guy, William Bingham, to the French colony of Martinique early in the war, right after July 4th, actually, 1776. They sent him out, and one of his tasks was to encourage the French to support American privateering efforts in the Caribbean. And he succeeded brilliantly, because by 1778 it was estimated that American privateers had captured roughly 250 British ships in the Caribbean alone. And British trade with their sugar islands, which was the most important source of money, external money, for Great Britain, plummeted by 66%. So alarming were these figures that the Earl of Suffolk urged Parliament to keep them from the public, pointing out the impropriety of acknowledging what ought not to be acknowledged at so critical a period, the weakness of the nation. Meanwhile, Benjamin Franklin, who seemed to be everywhere during the American Revolution, was in France, trying to negotiate a peace treaty or treaty of alliance with the French. Now, Franklin, who was an astute observer of the way things operated, was convinced that privateering was helping with the American cause with the French, while at the same time injuring Britain. That which makes the greatest impression in our favor here, Franklin wrote, is the prodigious success of our armed ships and privateers. When I look at this painting, I mean, it blows me away to think That was only a couple hundred years ago. We still have monarchy, I guess, in England. It's quite different. Well, in some ways different than this. But it's just amazing to me that just, 200-300 years ago, Europe was filled with monarchs who dressed like this and acted with virtually autocratic, unchecked power. Anyway, London's public advertiser asserted that if France continued to allow American privateers to sail from French ports, an immediate war between France and this country will be the inevitable consequence. Now, of course, the critical turning point in the war was the American victory over the British at the Battle of Saratoga on October 17, 1777. That was a real turning point. Now, privateering, while not causing a sharp turn in American fortunes on its own, helped to create the situation in which this great victory could prove decisive in bringing America into the conflict. And it did so by greatly increasing the enmity between France and Britain, and also inflicting serious damage on the British economy. Arguably the most horrific chapter in the American Revolution, and the most difficult chapter in the book for me to write, involves the British prisons, both in England and the British prison ships in New York. In both places, American privateersmen made up the bulk of the prison populations. Now, the two main prisons in Britain were Mill and Fortin Prison, and together they held about 3,000 men during the course of the war. The average annual death rate in these prisons was between 3 and 6%, which is pretty standard for a prison of that era. Now, Mill and Fortin prisons were bad enough, but by far the worst experience any combatant had to endure was a stay at one of the British prison ships moored off New York City. Between 15,000 and 22,000 men were held on these ships. Now, all of the prison ships were dreadful, but the Jersey was by far the worst. Nicknamed Hell Afloat, the Jersey had been a fourth-rate 64-gun British warship before it was transformed into a prison ship. It was the largest of the prison ships, and it held at any one time between 850 and 1,200 prisoners. Just imagine having 1,200 people below decks on that ship, just about 200 feet from the shore, so they could see land, but they couldn't get there. Between 6 and 12 men died per day on the Jersey. Every morning as the sun rose, the guards would yell, "Rebels, bring up your dead." One inmate left the following damning portrait of his time on the Jersey. There were about 1,100 prisoners on board. There were no berths or seats to lie down on, not a bench to sit on. Many were almost without clothes. The dysentery, fever, frenzy, and despair prevailed among them and filled the place with filth, disgust, and horror. The scantiness of the allowance, the bad quality of the provisions, the brutality of the guards, and the sick pining for comforts they could not obtain, altogether furnished continually one of the greatest scenes of human distress and misery ever beheld. The number of deaths on the Jersey alone is shocking. It is estimated that 11,500 men died, most of them privateers. By comparison, in the entire war, somewhere between 4,400 and 6,800 Americans were killed in action. Now, one of the biggest criticisms of privateers is they siphon valuable manpower from the Continental Navy, and that is absolutely true. Many men chose to become privateers rather than join the Navy in the hopes of making more money and having less rigid discipline to deal with. But that doesn't mean, had there been no privateers, that the Continental Navy would suddenly have been transformed into a fearsome fighting force. There were roughly 60 Continental Navy warships operating in the Atlantic at various times during the Revolution. Building and assembling a navy from scratch would have overwhelmed a smoothly running, well-financed government. American colonies were anything but. They couldn't even levy taxes, and it was hard to keep the 13 colonies pulling in the same direction. So starting a navy was almost an insurmountable challenge. The Continental Navy's record in battle is not an enviable one. 28 vessels were captured or destroyed, and many others were lost at sea, sold, or returned to France, or burned to keep them from being taken by the enemy. At war's end, just a few Navy ships were left. There were, however, a few bright spots in the history of the Continental Navy during the Revolution. Raids on munitions depots in the Caribbean brought back much-needed gunpowder. Navy ships did an excellent job of ferrying diplomats across the ocean, and they captured roughly 200 prizes. Nevertheless, in July 1780, John Adams reflected on the fortunes of the Continental Navy, and bear in mind, he is somebody who was a great supporter of the Navy. But what he wrote was, in looking over the long list of vessels belonging to the United States, taken and destroyed, and recollecting the whole history of the rise and progress of our Navy, it is very difficult to avoid tears. The American Revolution was the Navy's first hour, but it was not its finest. In the absence of a powerful Navy, America relied heavily on its privateers. Under the circumstances, that was the best strategy available. We're almost done. On the home front, privateers contributed materially to the American economy. Privateering was a great economic boon for coastal communities. It kept many businesses afloat during the war and created new ones, as well as new fortunes. The money that privateersmen earned also helped them support their families and sent a spark through local economies. Each prize auction delivered a stream of commodities that the colonies were in desperate need of. In August of 1779, a thankful Pennsylvanian told Congress that privateers have rendered us the most essential services and brought us many articles for public and private use, without which the war could hardly have been supported. There was, however, one privateer who was very upset about his role in contributing to the American economy. He returned home from a cruise in February of 1779, only to discover that his hard-earned savings had been depleted by his wife. He took out an ad in a local newspaper that read as follows: "Whereas Elizabeth, the wife of me, the subscriber, has run me in debt while I was at sea, wasting my substance by riotous living. And as I am in danger of being further run in debt by the said Elizabeth, this is to warn all persons harboring or trusting her on my account for the future, as I will not pay 1 farthing from this date. Whether the marriage lasted is unknown." The formal end of the war came on September 3rd, 1783, when the Treaty of Paris was signed. Surviving privateers were transformed into merchant ships, which brought American wares to new ports all around the world, proudly flying the nation's new flag. The men who owned and financed privateers, as well as those who fought on their decks, looked back on their accomplishments with pride and wondered, as did all Americans, what the future would bring for themselves and their new country. And that's the end of Rebels at Sea. I'll tell you briefly about my new book, since people always ask me about it. I'm just finishing up a book. It's about 5 men. One of these days I'm going to write a book just about women. People always bug me about that. How come your books don't have more women in them? It's not, you've got nothing against women. I love women. The only reason I'm a writer is because of my wife. And but all the topics I choose, since they're hundreds of years ago and focus on the things that I focus on, they seem to involve more men than women. And that's certainly the case with my new book. However, there are 6 or 7 women in it. It's about 5 men, 2 Americans and 3 British men, who were intentionally marooned or cast away on the Falkland Islands during the War of 1812, and they survived there alone for 534 days. But the book is really a story about what happened before, which involved a shipwreck, a rescue, what happened after, legal proceedings, and it's just a fascinating story of treachery, deceit, dishonor, and survival at the edge of the world. So I've had fun writing it. We'll see if anybody wants to read it. So that's it. Thanks a lot for listening. I appreciate it, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Yeah, go ahead.
You say they brought their prizes back to sell them.
Yeah.
Who had the resources to pay all that money?
Oh, well,
before, one of the things you have to keep in mind, the American Revolution was really about money. It was sort of fomented by merchants in the United States, in the colonies, who were very wealthy. The United States, the colonies on the eve of the Revolution, had the highest per capita income of any Western area. They were part of England at the time. The American colonies were very wealthy in the 1760s and early 1770s. They had a big layer, sort of like today. There's a small, a decent-sized layer of people that are mega wealthy. Then there are a lot of people that aren't, and there are people in between. In the colonies, there were quite a few very deep-pocketed merchants. And they're the ones that owned the ships that were merchant ships before the American Revolution, that were fishing vessels. They offered up their vessels to be privateers. They purchased ships as well. There were some ships that were built specifically to be privateers, like Elias Haskett Derby of Derby Wharf fame in Salem. He was one of the richest men in America. He was the first American millionaire. He built a 300-ton ship called the Grand Turk, specifically to be a privateer. It had more than 30 cannons on board. It was like a very powerful frigate almost. So there were enough people in the colonies who had money to support privateering. And then once they started bringing in all these British ships, a great number of those British ships that were captured as prizes, brought into America, and were sold to merchants who turned around and turned them into privateers. So it was sort of like a revolving door at some level. But you really need to think about, and I have a big section in the book about this and money in the Americas. The colonies were not a backward, poor, area. They were a pretty cosmopolitan, knowledgeable, fairly well educated, and a lot of people in the colonies were quite wealthy. And they certainly were wealthy enough to finance privateering. They're also wealthy enough to finance poorly at some times the Continental Army. And there were people like Robert Morris, the financier of the Revolution, who had very deep pockets. And if it wasn't for those rich people, we wouldn't have won the war. I mean, the only reason we really won the war, there's a lot of mythology about the American Revolution. We didn't win just because of George Washington. He was very important. I'm glad he was our general. Another guy, not a woman at that time, might have won. But really, the main reason we won is because England was so arrogant. And they were so arrogant at the outset of the war, they viewed us as a rabble in arms. They didn't take the war seriously enough at the outset. If they had, and they had, for example, if Gates had pursued Washington out of New York instead of letting him go, I think that would have ended the war. But there was always this reticence in the beginning because they thought it would be over very quickly. They didn't think the Americans would have the backbone to pull it out for year after year. And what George Washington did so brilliantly, and why he's a great leader, is he learned how to lose just bad enough so he could fight another day. And it really was a war of attrition, because even at the end of the war, another thing people don't realize, at the end of the war, the British Navy was more powerful than it was at the beginning of the war, way more powerful. They were not in bad economic shape by the end of the war, Britain. They took a real hit, but they were still a very wealthy country. They could have continued the war for many more years. They just got tired of it, and a lot of merchants were tired of losing their ships, and they basically said, enough with these Americans, let them have their own country. They'll either fail in 10 or 15 years, which was the hope, or in the meantime, we'll get back one of our best markets. And that's exactly what happened after the end of the American Revolution. We became friendly again with Great Britain. We threw France aside, and we basically, our biggest trading partners after the war was who else? Great Britain. So, anyway.
You'd also mentioned that in your book when you're talking about the China trade, that America didn't have any places where they could deal business in China. The British places allowed Americans to set up shop over there so they could do trade with the Chinese.
Right. Well, right after the American Revolution, we were free to go to China. You're right. We went there. But pretty soon after we went there on our own ships, England, the British traders there, merchants, were not so welcoming of the Americans. It was competition. And in pretty short order, the Americans got their own building, one of the factory buildings in Canton, the little area where all the foreigners, the foreign devils, were allowed to live and trade with the local Han merchants. So the Americans, soon after 1783, 1784, 85, they were pretty well established in Canton. And, they got along with the British. There's some interesting quotes in my book, When America First Met China, about American sailors sort of basically flipping the bird at their British counterparts, saying basically, we beat you. So there's a lot of that going on after the American Revolution. But a lot of the more educated, wealthy Americans went right back into an old groove, and they became quite friendly with their wealthy merchant counterparts in England. Oh, you're limited to 3 questions. Go ahead.
Okay.
No, you have this.
Last
This is your third.
One more.
The Second War with Britain.
The second, 1812. Yeah.
Completely different. They shut down all our ports.
Yep.
Broke the back of Salem. Why didn't that happen? Because Britain wasn't ready when we started in 1776,
Oh,
but
is
they
it-
were
oh,
in
is-
1812.
I'm not an expert in the War of 1812, but it was different strategies. They were fighting a different foe. The United States, the Navy was much more powerful. We did lose a lot. We didn't have very powerful military. We sort of, after the American Revolution, the United States sort of gave up on the military option. They destroyed their Navy, and they didn't have much of an army to speak of. And then they were getting spanked by the Algerian and Moroccan, the Barbary Coast pirates, and the quasi-war with France. That helped us reinvigorate our Navy. That was very important. And we sort of built up our military. But then after the quasi-war ended in the late 1700s, and we basically won the war with the Barbary pirates, it really wasn't much of a war. People make much more of it than I think they should, but that's another story. After the Barbary War ended, the Americans went back into their shell to some extent, and they said, well, we're a neutral nation. The entire Europe, all of Europe is at war. The Napoleonic Wars were going on, and America was very happy. American merchants were very happy to serve as a neutral carrier of goods to the French, to the British. But what happened is the British started passing laws that restricted the ability of American merchants to go anywhere on the continent. The French did the same thing, and we slowly got pulled into this War of 1812. I think that, again, the reason the British didn't win is they didn't have their heart in it. I don't know how to explain it. They won, they beat Napoleon so they could focus attention on America, but I don't know. On paper, they should have won again. They didn't. The Americans fought valiantly. We had some very good naval conflicts that we won. The USS Constitution gained great fame during the War of 1812. I'm not as familiar with the battles on land, but some went well, some didn't. The biggest winner in the War of 1812, I don't think the Americans won the War of 1812. I don't think the British won the War of 1812. The only people that won the War of 1812 was Canada, because we wanted to take them over. We tried a couple of times. We didn't do it. We should have done that. I'd love to have Canada. I like Canada. But and the turkey should definitely be our national bird. I agree 100% with Benjamin Franklin. But anyway, so I don't know. I'm not an expert on the War of 1812, even though I'm writing this book about the War of 1812. I only have one chapter on the war, and it's just a launching point for what happens halfway around the world, where there are people, some know there was a war, others don't. They're British, they're Americans. It's a very interesting situation. But the War of 1812, for many years, before 2012, the 200th anniversary, the War of 1812 was a neglected area of history, I think. And a lot of people don't know much about the War of 1812. I think more people do now, but for whatever reason, it doesn't grab the same attention as our seminal war, the American Revolution, or the Civil War, or of course, World War II, the World Wars. But nobody knows about the Mexican War today, really. Or we were involved in other little skirmishes, and we don't really. History is. It's funny when you look at books that do well or books that are rewritten over and over again. Americans love their mythical heroes, and many of them deserve hero worship. I mean, they're great individuals, but as I was saying before I gave the talk, there were something like 16,000 books written about Abraham Lincoln. There are not 16,000 books worth of material to write about Abraham Lincoln. He's a great guy. I've read a number of books about him, but we tend to go back to the same things over and over again. And the American Revolution is a classic example. You know, the Civil War probably has more books written about it than the American Revolution, but the American Revolution is probably a close second. The reason I was interested in writing this book was not that I wanted to write another book about the American Revolution. I find it a fascinating era. It was only because I thought this is one little slice of the American Revolution that a lot of people don't know about. That's what made it interesting for me. And that's why the book I'm writing now I find interesting, because it wasn't even a big story back when it happened. There was one book written about it, and everybody sort of forgotten about it. And it's a story about people that weren't famous before they got involved in this situation, that faded into obscurity after this horrible situation. But during this event, it's just gripping human drama. Sorry.
Did the British have any privateers?
Oh yeah, the British had thousands of privateers, and they actually compartmentalized them because, you know, after France joined the war on our side, it became a world war because Britain was now at war with France and Spain, and the Dutch got involved a little bit, but the Britain, who was the expert in privateering, and they taught Americans how to do it during the 7 Years' War and the War of Jenkins' Ear. American colonies sent out a lot of privateers, so they sort of learned at the feet of the British and then used it against them in the American Revolution. But during the war, the British, starting in about 1777, they started issuing letters of marque, and they issued almost 2,000 to ships to attack Americans. They issued another 2,000 specifically to attack French ships, another 2,000 specifically to attack Spanish ships. But the British privateers were not as successful as our privateers. They captured about 600, maybe 700 American ships during the war. They captured a lot of French ships. And so yes, they were into privateering. And I think one of the most interesting aspects of that I talk about in the book is New York was in British control for most of the war. And there were a lot of loyalists there, a lot of loyalists who had money, merchants. So New York alone sent out about 160 privateers to attack American ships. And you read the articles about it. I mean, these people, they hated the rebels. I mean, they were obviously the loyalists. But that was their way of getting back at the Americans. So, yeah, not all's fair in love and war, but privateering was a well-established practice, and it came back in the War of 1812. During the War of 1812, there were about 600 American privateers. And Theodore Roosevelt, in his magisterial book about the Navy, gave a lot of credit to the privateers in winning that war, quote unquote, winning that war. So, yeah. Anyway. Any other questions or? Nope. Okay, if you're interested, I did bring books, but other than that, thanks for inviting me back. And in a year or two, you'll see this new book, which will be very different from all my other books. For one thing, it's going to be shorter. Another thing is it has more than 40 chapters. You know, usually my books have 9 chapters, but this book is very fast-paced and has three or four different stories going forward at the same time. So in some ways, it was more difficult to write. But.
Thank you very much indeed, Aaron.
Sure.
And, to everybody, thank you very much for coming, and wish you all a happy Thanksgiving and pleasant holidays. We'll see you all next year.